Most are afraid of unknown depths, skirting shores thinking world flat, and with the island girls in celebration of new religion. Nobody led me or said this way. I sailed alone on makeshift raft with wind as companion. Fate for deliverance, confidence enough to assess new disposition. Seekers of lost paradise may seem fools to those who never sought the other worlds. Welcome to Momentary Zen with Zen Garcia. Visit www.fallenangels.tv. You're listening to Revolution Radio.
Welcome, friends. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Momentary Zen here on Revolution Radio, and thank you all for taking the time to join us. Hello and welcome everybody in the chat room. Always good to fellowship with you and to share this time for discourse and discovery. And I'm really excited to have as guest with me this evening Troy McLachlan, and he is coming to us live from across the pond. And so I appreciate you taking the time to stay up and be with us, Troy. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be able to interview and discourse with you in the way that we've been able to do.
Hey, no, Zen, it's all my pleasure. Great to be here.
Well, I know the people in the chat room are really excited. They're already a buzz with your guest appearance here, and so you've got a lot of fans on Revolution Radio, and
Really?
and so I know it'll be an interesting show, and also happy early Thanksgiving to yourself and to all of those that are also in the chat room. But before we start, Troy, I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk about your websites and any books, projects, or contact information that you'd like to share, and then we'll get into it.
Oh, yeah, thanks very much, Zen. As you said, I am the author of an ebook called The Saturn Death Cult, which is available on Amazon in the Kindle format. I also run a parallel website that pretty much follows the book called SaturnDeathCult.com that people can go to, where they can check out the illustrations. The book version has, of course, more information on some of the aspects of the cosmology discussed under this topic and such, but the website is a good place for a lot of people to start if they want to check out things further. I am in the process of writing a follow-up, which I'm calling Crimes of the Saturn Death Cult. I have a German publisher who's interested in taking the Saturn Death Cult and the Crimes of the Saturn Death Cult into the German language sphere. So I'm working hard on getting that sorted out. And I also run my own troydmclaughlinbooks.com, where you can get some of my attempts at fiction, the idea of being that to use fiction to open eyes, fictionalized to open eyes, in some of the stuff that I've got on there that people can check out if they find the topic of Saturn Death Cult to be of interest. So just to reiterate, SaturnDeathCult.com is the website. The book is called Saturn Death Cult. It's available on Kindle, and there are also a number of other books that I've put out in the fiction realm that you can find on TroyDMcLaughlinBooks.com.
Okay, excellent. Well, a couple comments here. Finn again in the chat room said that he just recently wrote a blog about your work, and he had mentioned and linked some of your material in there. And also, a Pale Rider asked if you could, if to turn up your mic, if that's a possibility.
Turn up my mic, right? He says to the complete technophobe.
Well, if
okay, I'll tell you what. How about I just come a little bit closer?
Yeah, that might.
Tell me if that's better. But
Well,
You know,
I hear
to
you
something like
fine.
that.
Personally, I don't have a problem with sound. I hear you fine, but everybody's computer is different, and so some people might not be able. I'm sure you'll be loud and clear on the archives as well. But yeah, if you could do that, just come a little closer to your mic, and maybe the sound will increase. But wanted to can you give us an idea as to both of your books, what they are about, as well as the new one that you have coming out? Kind of a brief rundown on the
Oh yes,
content,
of course.
and what inspired you to write both.
Okay, well, yes, of course, I did forget through the first part there. I am also the co-author of a kind of prequel to the Saturn Death Cult book that I wrote, which is called Cosmos and Collision. I wrote that with a fellow sort of renegade researcher, a guy called Ted Holden. It's called Cosmos and Collision. We have a website, cosmosandcollision.com, which basically discusses the question of the cosmology that is touched upon in Saturn Death Cult. We go into greater detail with regards to how that works, the physics and so on, and discuss what the solar system probably looked like before the arrival of Saturn. And I guess at that point, to bring your listeners up to speed, those that might not know the topics then, I guess when I wrote Saturn Death Cult nearly 4 years ago, I I did so because I had noticed a growing awareness amongst alternative thinkers as to the role played by the god Saturn in the occult. The use of Saturnian symbols in our money systems and advertising industries was being increasingly commented on by those who were trying to alert people to, hidden menace in our society. But what I felt was not being recognized was that there was a perfectly natural explanation for how the state of affairs had come about. And it is an explanation that only emphasizes just how corrupt and how dangerous certain occult agendas really are. So I wrote Saturn Death Cult as a basic introduction to the idea that world mythology is the human witnessed record of Earth's arrival. And this for many people is probably the most mind-blowing aspect of the work I've done. But it's basically about mythology being the witness record of Earth's arrival into the solar system as a satellite of a brown dwarf star. This brown dwarf star, according to the electric universe model of physics, later became known as the planet Saturn and was originally worshipped as Earth's original sun by virtually all human cultures and races, and designated as the creative power or God behind the formation of the early Earth and its inhabitants. It was, however, the ensuing catastrophic rearrangement of the planets around the sun uh, as a result of this capturing of this brown dwarf that became Saturn, that then produced an ongoing fear of impending, cosmic doomsday within the human psyche that is still with us today. Doom porn, all that kind of thing that people often refer to. And it's the subconscious fear of another doomsday within the human species and its resultant psychological archetypes, its mythicals that come with it, that I argue has been subsequently manipulated by various elite and occult agendas over time to produce a worldwide culture of authoritarian rule, the type of rule that I call a death cult. And this is important because I call it a death cult purely because it's through the manipulation of Saturn-based forms of religion um, that humans have seemingly always been subjected to types of rule that ensure that the majority of us will sacrifice our productive labor and lives for the benefit of an elite minority. And my book, The Saturn Death Cult, introduced this sort of idea, and it acts as a very basic introduction, a lot of illustration involved, but it introduces the idea that elite minorities have been able to perpetuate their control over the majority due to their ability to play on these deeply rooted subconscious archetypes and fear symbols, all of them from interplanetary cataclysms witnessed by our ancestors. And that this basically afflicts virtually every race and nation on this planet in some form or another. And the elite's control over us subsequently stems from their distortion of the Saturn-based mythologies, this witnessing of the interplanetary cataclysms that took place millennia ago, and turning them into corrupted religions and occult agendas, and it allows the elite to claim authority over the majority based on a supposed hidden knowledge of the creator god Saturn. This, of course, is directly linked into the idea that Saturn, in all its forms throughout world mythology, is said to have once ruled over a paradise-like golden age in which humanity flourished, but that this golden age was lost in the cataclysms we've been talking about. And this left humanity stranded in its current less than happy condition. And this has obviously given, in my opinion, certain elites the opportunity to claim they can lead humanity back into another golden age, but one in which they are firmly in control. So essentially, what I'm arguing is for the idea that most forms of authoritarian rule are attempts by privileged and occult elites to recreate this lost Saturnian golden age, to establish a new golden age, but one which simply amounts to the elite getting a free lunch off the majority of the population. This is a con job, this free lunch for the elite, that I argue is manifested today in the form of the debt-based financial system, typified by today's current central banking model of international finance. The central banking model of debt-based finance is a death cult because its use of usury ensures that over time a growing number of people always lose and often die due to the scarcity of money and the fight over resources, while the true wealth generated and created by the majority is gradually transferred via usury to the hidden elite, this 1% of the 1%. So the fact that this very same debt-based financial model is behind the arms trade, the drug trade, and the sex slavery trade only adds to its definition, in my opinion, as a death cult.
Yeah, I can totally see that and how it's tied to everything that is going on covertly behind the scenes from those ruling from the shadows. Your upcoming book?
Well, obviously a lot of, there are two types of readers that I've encountered, in terms of the original ebook. Those who are interested in the cosmology, the physics behind this seemingly outlandish idea that Earth was originally a satellite of the planet Saturn, and you basically had a rearrangement of the planets during the time of human inhabitation on Earth. For many people, this is the more fascinating aspect of what they're introduced to in Saturn Death Cult, and for most, it's almost unbelievable. Then there are other readers who are also highly interested in how this affects us today. So what if we did have Saturn as our original sun and so on? We've got issues today, and what is the outcome today from all this that affects us on a day-to-day level? And as part of that, I've been slowly but surely researching, for requests to give examples of how this death cult is in action. And to that end, I've been compiling a number of essays on what I call crimes of the Saturn Death Cult, which I intend to release as a sequel to the Saturn Death Cult itself, which discusses various elements that come into play when discussing this culture that I call the Saturn Death Cult.
Well, I had sent you an email prior to us going live, and I think this is a good place for me to ask you the question about um, Friday the 13th and the attack on Paris, because a lot of people are saying that that was a blood sacrifice, and that this kind of thing happens so often in Hollywood with all these different actors or family members, and there's speculation that in their signing pacts with the devil in order to gain and achieve success and riches in the way and fame in the way that they do, that they have to, um, you know, bargain with family members or loved ones or children, or in some way offer up as sacrifice some loved one, or some. A lot of times that happens with girlfriends or anything like that. Can you comment on that, and also the Paris attacks on um, Friday the 13th?
Yeah, I can't, confirm or anything through any knowledge, direct knowledge, or anything to that matter that this is definitely a blood sacrifice. I
Right, right.
can't say that I am convinced of the idea of blood sacrifices having been perpetrated down through history. That it is a part of this culture that I call, the the Saturn death cult sort of idea. Um, whether or not that was specifically, ordered, so to speak, as a blood sacrifice. My website, my book, initially sort of is touted along the lines as, mythology as, uh, you know, uh, history as ritual. All right, that basically history has been manipulated down through time as a form of ritual by people who have these distorted understandings of what Saturn mythology and the religions based around that are. So within that context, one can talk about blood rituals from, and this is not to belittle what happened in Paris, but events as small as the one in Paris to events as gigantic as the Second World War.
Right.
The Black Death in Europe, these sorts of things. The point is that um, it comes back to the old, Roman investigative precept, which is cui bono, who benefits, who, you know, who basically who benefits from something like this in terms of, from that point of view, I'm completely convinced that these events happen as a means to further the hidden elites, the hidden agendas of these people, uh, towards this idea of a one world government that is basically their concept. Is, some people call it a new world order, but it's their concept of a new golden age. We are being through chaos comes order and under this thinking, and we've been manipulated through Hegelian dialectic, which is the creating of two different arguments, bringing them into conflict to get the desired result forward. And this has a certainly on the geopolitical level, without even going into occult, understandings of whether this is blood sacrifice, and some people actually get into occult circles and get off on this kind of stuff. It certainly plays into the overall occult ritual of the manipulation of history towards a goal, in which Islamic terrorism is very much the extension of what we saw in the 1970s, a thing called the Gladio operations in Europe, with the
Right.
terrorist stuff that was happening there, and has once again manifested, in the carnage that we see, that is very typical of this sort of strategy of tension, as they call it, to push us into areas where we give up our freedoms, where we allow a police state to encroach ever more. In the United States, where there's a lot of emphasis on celebrities and blood rituals and things like that. But I would take you back to the granddaddy of all these sorts of events, which would be the Manson killings, or what you would call the Tate LaBianca killings back in the late '60s, and the almost where the cat was let out of the bag, where the serial killing plague that has terrorized America, whereas terrorism itself is often the European Middle East thing, but America was terrorized by the serial killing plague that erupted from the '60s onwards in the United States. to me, I would go with Dave McGowan's idea that a lot of the stuff, the lone serial killer myth is a patsy idea, hiding the idea this is organized. This serial killing is often an organized element, forcing the American public to accept ever more stringent police controls
Right.
over their daily lives. So, it's more of the same as such. But I would love to discuss further the links to Gladio, because if people want to sort of get an idea of this culture that I call the Saturn Death Cult in action, where it leads to, then what we've seen in Paris, what we're seeing with the country Turkey and Syrian conflict, all that is very much an extension of what literally began during the build up to the First World War, not even the Second World War, but the First World War, and it seems to be in our time playing itself out now to its final conclusion.
Yeah, well, feel free. And just for the members of the listening audience, know that I do have your questions and I will ask Troy about those, but I want to give him the opportunity to elaborate on this. And so when we, after the next break, I'll ask him the questions that you have posted in the chat room. But yeah, Troy, feel free to elaborate, please.
Okay, well, in the context of what I've been writing, the work that I've been involved in, I often get asked by people to name and shame, to give us an example of who these guys are, and of course, in the in Saturn Death Cult, I use my own nomenclature, which is sort of a naming system that I have based on certain biblical concepts. The idea like cities equal systems, which equal cultures.
Right.
And in describing, the Saturn Death Cult, I choose this type of nomenclature because it will resonate with those born into the Western cultural sphere, which is basically the so-called Judeo-Christian sphere, and it even includes the Islamic derived cultures and so on. But much of it sources its moral and legal precepts from the Hebrew Scriptures, and most of all, it is aimed at what's I'm talking about in the book is aimed at what some of us call the Anglosphere, the English-speaking West, that is currently involved in this unending war against drugs, unending war against terrorism, and so on. Okay, and because this I focus on this because this is where today's central banking model of international debt-based finance is derived from. It is basically a product of the Anglo-American sphere of influence. And so when I talk about in Saturn Death Cult, the book, about an entity that I call Mystery Babylon, I'm referring to a system or a city alluded to in the Bible as being personified by ancient Babylon, and which will always, according to these scriptures, be with us in the form of a hidden kingdom of merchants. Now, to me, this is incredibly important for people to understand how the finance model that we're talking about ultimately backs up what, to many of us, we experience in the form of what I came to understand as the God industry, or the God's industry. Now, this is something I discuss in Saturn Death Cult. The God industry, for those who want to get examples of how this death cult works in action, God was a term used in a film called The Veteran. It's a British film about a guy returning from Afghanistan, where some preachy guy gets up and talks about the God industry, guns, oil, and drugs. And it occurred to me that what was missing from that equation was, of course, the slavery or the sex slavery part of it. So the gods industry, I feel, is a better acronym for guns, weapons, the arms trade, oil, energy, control over food, genetically modified plants, this sort of stuff, drugs, illegal drugs, but also pharmaceuticals from the major companies, from everything from even including fluoridation, this kind of activity where we basically have a drugged out population on so many levels, and of course sex slavery, what's often referred to as white slavery, and such, where humans have been used as collateral for any number of wonderful things. Now, the drugs part of the equation, the illegal drugs part, often represented in the Bible as Sodom and Gomorrah. For many people, Sodom and Gomorrah has sexual connotations, particularly being used as a pejorative against homosexuality and this sort of behavior. But a careful analysis of the Bible actually relates that the grapes of Sodom relate to the opium plant. And the control of the opium fields was basically what Sodom and Gomorrah were about. Yes, moral licentiousness was practiced at this time, but it was the opium aspect that was the defining characteristic of what was Sodom and Gomorrah in ancient times, and it was this poison of the poppy that was offered to Christ on the cross when, according to Scripture, that he rejected at the time of his death. And of course, Hebrew Scripture had prohibitions against the opium trade because of its resultant tendency to sort of back up governments in power and so on, be used as a tool for that nature. But in parallel to the drugs industry, of course, was this whole idea of horses and chariots, weapons, arms, and such things that come to be used as a way of enforcing what we see as the great con job of central banking, debt-based finance. There's only so much that you can con people into, but at some point in time, you need to back it up with violence. And this is where the guns part of the gods industry comes in, the weapons part, and is particularly prominent in the modern age, in what we're seeing with all these proxy wars and so on that are around us.
Hold on, Troy.
Sure.
We'll be right back, everyone. All right, welcome back, everybody. Troy, I don't want to break your train of thought, so I'm going to give you a chance to finish what you were talking about, and then I've got 3 questions, which I'm sure you'll be able to answer quickly, but we'll get to those when you finish this particular topic.
Okay, well, just then very, very quickly, summarizing the ancient roots of the illegal drug industry has always acted as a financial source for the war model that we often see down through history being used to maintain the position of the elites as they come down. Now, the key aspect here is that the drugs industry provides financing, but the central banking debt-based finance model in the modern world facilitates that financing. And so you get a symbiotic relationship between war, drugs, finance, where they have to create a merry-go-round of conflict in the world, which basically acts as a means for building up what we all know as the military-industrial complex. And the world that we're living in at the moment is very much now a world where we've had, I think really since the Second World War, a tendency towards what some people term as synthetic warfare or synthetic terrorism and so on. And part of that measure by which the elites, particularly in the West, this Anglosphere, maintained their control, was hinted at. Well, I shouldn't say hinted, was overtly seen in the acts of what has come to be known as the Gladio stay-behind armies of NATO in Europe, who were basically initially created as a type of army that would stay behind in the event of a Soviet invasion that overran Western Europe, and they would act as guerrilla forces and so on. What happened, though, was that as the decades rolled on, these groups became a means by which to create what they called a strategy of tension throughout Europe, where they created false flag attacks throughout the continent that were blamed often on left-wing groups, and were used to force people into adopting, well, into basically agreeing with a policy of ever growing the NATO military structure and the industrial complex that we have in the world as we see it today. Now, the the interesting thing, excuse me, the interesting thing that I have been listening to is the work being done by a open source journalist, guy called James Corbett, of the James Corbett Report. His interviews with a woman, an FBI whistleblower called Sybil Edmonds, and it's one of those things that falls into place when you listen to what they're saying. After the terrorist attacks of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, the Brabant killings in Belgium, all these sorts of things, these scandals, and even when the Italian Prime Minister admitted, see, this is not conspiracy theory, this is fact. They admitted, the Italian Prime Minister in the Italian Parliament admitted that many of the terrorist acts committed in Italy itself were committed by these NATO stay-behind armies as part of this strategy of tension to keep us all scared of the next threat. When the Russian threat was dissipated with the fall of communism in Russia, the threat wasn't there, and so you basically had a winding down of the military-industrial complex's reason for existence, and so on. So a new threat had to be found, and we all know that basically the war on terrorism, which increasingly is becoming a war on Islam, and this clash of cultures idea and so on like that, a lot of it is very trumped up. There's a lot of false flags involved. But what Sybil Edmonds, James Corbett, Webster Tarpley is another commentator on this area are pointing out, is that with the failure of the terrorist attacks in Europe, they went to what you could call a B plan. And this is what Sybil Edmonds dubbed the Gladio B situation. And that was to replace the anti-communist, almost proto-fascist organizations of Europe in the stay-behind Gladio armies with a anti-atheist Islamic version that would bring about chaos in the Middle East and basically create the environment for the establishment of what many of us have referred to as the Project for the New American Century, groups like that, or the New World Order, basically.
Right.
And this particular change in strategy explains a lot of what we are seeing in Central Asia, a lot of the anti-Russian rhetoric that we've seen in the world, and which something that a lot of our listeners are probably fully aware of, and that is this almost bizarre idea that the very people that we are supposed to be fighting in the form of this Islamic State and Al-Qaeda and so on are actually being succored and supported by our own governments, here in the world. Why? Because it creates this tension that justifies a military-industrial complex that keeps the central banking model of debt-based finance ticking over. And this is what Webster Tarpley and people like that have called synthetic terrorism. And I think this is what we really mean by false flag attacks, and particularly the manipulation of some of these sort of Islamic extremists that we see. It's a continuation of that policy that was first created in the Gladio concepts in Europe. In other words, then what I'm saying is, if it's good enough for the Italian Prime Minister to admit that this stuff was going on, the logical interpretation of what we're seeing in terrorism today must surely be following the same pattern, since it does nothing more than boost the military-industrial complex as it stands today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back even further, like Nero and blaming the Christians for burning down parts of Rome. Even Hitler burning the Reichstag, and in World War II they pulled out the radar in Alaska and allowed the Japanese to successfully attack in order to draw us into war, even with you know, the
Yeah.
the Spanish American War, where they blew up their own battleship. I mean, their own ship sunk the Lusitania. I mean, these kind of things have been ongoing for so very long, and they've been, they keep the same modus operandi because they're so successful, and the public doesn't catch on. And even though there might be a certain aspect of, people that do know the truth, they're ostracized in such a way and ridiculed in such a way that many of them, until really recently after 9/11 and all that, have kept silent, because even when they do speak out, they're labeled psychotic and thrown into padded rooms and force-fed drugs or electroshocked or, disappeared, tortured. I mean, it's insane, the kind of measures, and all this is out in the public consciousness now. I mean, they don't even care to hide it. Um,
Well,
but
you see,
yeah,
I actually think that is a result because they're actually getting more desperate because of, just the ability of what you and I are doing, having a
right,
radio show like this. The whole sort of internet phenomenon has been something that has caught them off guard, so that knowledge, is increasingly, being spread around for people to understand how this goes. More and more people understand that the international drug trade is really controlled by intelligence services,
yes,
throughout the world and so on. For what reason and so on. Of course, if you've got something that's 400 to $600 billion industry, whichever estimate you're talking about, you have to ask, how is that facilitated? That kind of money, the banks have to be in on this, and this God's industry is driven by that financial system, and more people are starting to be able to, like the old Wizard of Oz, they're seeing the guy behind the curtain for what he is.
yes. Yeah, and I, think that's also reasons why countries are targeted, like China when they were at war against the British, and the Opium Wars, and
Well, the
Colombia for
opium,
the
to me,
cocaine.
the opium wars have to be the most disgusting example of the Saturn death cult in action, in terms of the use of drugs. Effectively, you're talking about a group of people, the British East India Company, the merchants of the British Empire. This is not necessarily perpetrated by the British people, but the merchants of that empire deciding to hook a whole nation on a life-destroying drug habit, solely for
Right.
profit. And the current royal family of Great Britain's wealth is derived from this. They're one of the major bullion banks, HSBC. They all had their fingers in this. And I'll tell you what, the Chinese haven't forgotten. This is something that the Western mind has trouble understanding. The Chinese have not forgotten this.
Right. Yeah, no doubt. And I'm sure it drives the hatred, for the forces and a lot of the colonial, those countries that were colonized by colonial forces. They have long memories, and I'm sure that they look forward to a time where they can avenge their fallen ancestors and their um, oppressed peoples back in historical times. Reasons for, even like Colombia and Afghanistan today, the
Mhm.
heroin and the cocaine trade. And so, yeah, those kind of things are still ongoing. I'll give you a chance to comment once more on this, Troy, and then I'm going to ask you these questions.
Well, I mean, in following up on that, if anything, we are lucky that the Chinese and I would say even the Russians are as they are in the world today, and people have been afflicted by this because it's my belief that in their cultures, which go back, particularly the Chinese, at 5,000 years, and so on, they're intelligent enough to know that we as a people are not necessarily responsible for the hurt that's been done to them. And it's my belief that the Chinese, the Russians and so on know fully well who the enemy is. It's this hidden kingdom of merchants,
Right.
using my own nomenclature from Saturn Death Cult. This Rothschild or Red Shield is what I term it. We all know I'm talking about the Rothschilds and so on.
Yes.
These are the people they're going after, and the trick for them, I think, is and we're very blessed, I believe, in future events, that they don't want to wipe us out. They know that we're captive to the system as much as they've been hurt by the system in the time. And if anything, it's my belief that the way events are shaping up, it's a form of liberation that's taking place. And as soon as we can get out from under the central banking model, the better we all are. And so I don't see them as attacking us and trying to wipe us out, holding us directly responsible. And I think that's a good thing. I think we're lucky that these people have that kind of wisdom.
Right. Well, in this day and age, as you said, with the internet and with the advent of so much knowledge and wisdom and so much insight coming forth on even the hundreds of years going back into the past on things that occurred, even decades or hundreds and even thousands of years ago. There's so much insight now that people are able to understand and point the finger at those that truly have been oppressing and attacking all of us, as far as the masses. And it is the elite and the Illuminati and
And increasingly,
those.
we're beginning to know who they are and how they operate. That's great.
Right. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think that is absolutely critical. And like you said, it is putting pressure on them, and increasingly desperate measures.
Uh,
All right, Troy. Well, let me relay these questions to you, and then I'll give you a chance to go into whatever it is, whatever direction it is you would like to. But Finn, I believe it was Finn, asked me to ask you about the documentary Alien Skies and the Saturnian priesthood in the Silver Age, and its link to volcanism. So we'll start with that question.
Um, Great. Yeah, Finn, thanks very much for the question. I'm assuming you're talking about the Alien Skies that's put out by the Thunderbolts group, and the work that's been done by Dave Talbot and people like that. That's what I'm assuming. Please let us know if I've got that wrong, because my answer is predicated on that. The as readers of Saturn Death Cult will find out, or those who've read know, the theory is based on very much the electric universe model of physics, for which is well, it's not the opposite, but it's a different system to the gravity only system of physics that the mainstream continues to hold on to in terms of explaining how the solar system works. And as far as that goes, Dave Talbot and so on are guys who have done fantastic work in looking into the precepts of the electric universe, but also Dave Talbot in particular, along with Eduardo Cardona and a couple of other noteworthy people, have improved upon the original Velikovskian ideas of the role of Saturn in how the role that it played. And this is called Saturn theory in the electric universe. And you could call it, if the electric universe is a fringe theory, then Saturn theory is on the fringe of that fringe theory. It's way out there. There are people in the electric universe that even reject this, but Saturn Death Cult very much holds to that idea that Saturn was the Earth's original sun. And as far as the priesthoods of the Silver Age go and their rising of this, essentially in Saturn theory, to summarize it up, there is a general agreement that about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, the Earth was in a relationship with the planet Saturn at about the time that it was being captured by the sun. And the influence of the sun pushed that relationship apart, resulting in massive cataclysms and the ending of what we call the Golden Age on the Earth. The Silver Age priesthood is basically the attempt to preserve what was known in the Golden Age, and again, Finn, I hope I've got the essence of what your question was about right.
He
Because
said yes, Troy.
oh,
This
great,
is what
okay,
he's asking you about.
right. The essence of that goes back to the idea that the Golden Age wasn't so much about a time of partying and a time of plenty. The Golden Age was when humanity first was able to conceive of measurements and weights, which is the basis of civilization. And it was those measures and weights, or the concept of just weights and measures, that the Silver Age tried to preserve after the Great Cataclysm. And it was those ideas of weights and measures, those ideas of moral concepts that formed many of what you would call, the origins of many of what we call the world religions today, which were eventually corrupted with the advent of money. And of course, the advent of money and trade, which, to use Hebrew scripture as an example, is represented by the term Babylon or Babel, the famous Tower of Babel and so on like that. It is when you understand money as a measure of work done, of the productive capacity of something, of a group of people. If you have the ability to mess around with that measure and manipulate it, you can actually create a situation where you can get something for nothing. And this corruption started to take place during the end of what I would call the Silver Age, roughly going into the time, probably ending at around about 3000 BC or so, which is about 5,000 years ago. But that corruption is at the heart of what created the finance system that all world major religions condemn, this usury debt-based finance system that flares up in our collective histories time and time again. And it is purely a distortion of those true weights and measures that the Silver Age tried to preserve in the form of mythology and ultimately religion.
All right. Well, Finn says thank you so much, Troy. Excellent answer. He really appreciates your effort to clarify. Um,
Pleasure, Finn. Thank you very much.
this one was from Doc Who and Walk in Truth. They're talking about the two black cubes, the at Mecca, and I guess there's one that's been recently stalled at Ground Zero at 9/11. If you have comment on that, as far as the symbology of Saturn worship and its connections there.
Sure. Well, you see, Saturn worship is a big problem for many people. The idea that Saturn was the original sun, and ultimately that original sun was the actual planet Saturn, and that actual planet is where we derive the god Saturn of mythology. A lot of a lot of people have a problem with this, particularly in mainstream circles, mainstream academia, because
Hold on, Troy. Well, I'll
pick
give you
up on that.
plenty of time on the other side. We'll be right back, everyone. Welcome back, everybody, for second hour. Your host, Zen Garcia. This is Momentary Zen, and I have as guest with me Troy McLachlan of the SaturnDeathCult.com. I do want to remind the listening audience that Revolution Radio is a listener-supported, commercial-free, and corporate-free radio network, the largest in the world, and that we do need your support in order to continue paying for the servers and coming to you in the way that we do, and utilizing the various studios A and B as platforms for talking about all the critical issues and current events and topics that so many others won't speak about or are controlled to not be able to. And so those of you that can, go to freedomslips.com, click on the donate button, and support us. So we thank you in advance for your support, and thanks for your fellowship and your awesome dialogue. All right, Troy, I want to give you a chance to finish up, but also, if you would, please give out your website contact and where people can go to find your books once more, and then continue on with your answer to the previous question.
Okay, sure. I'm the author of Saturn, the Saturn Death Cult, which is available on Kindle through Amazon. There's also a website that closely follows the book called SaturnDeathCult.com, and you can read much of what we're discussing. You can get a basic introduction to all these concepts that we're discussing here now. So,
All right, excellent. Well, we were talking about the two black cubes and their connections to the Saturn Death Cult and to Saturn worship. And I'm not sure, did you get a chance to elaborate or to
yeah,
cover it the way that you wanted to?
no, because it's a very good question, and it takes a little bit of understanding as to the role of Saturn, and
Sure, sure.
it helps people grasp just how ingrained the Saturn connection is with regards to what I'm talking about, how it's infused in so many aspects of so many different religions that we have out there. As far as the black cube goes. Whether that's in the Islamic expression of it, they have in Mecca. You can also find the aspects of it in Judaism and so on. What it's really based upon, if we take as a supposition that Saturn, the planet Saturn, was worshipped as the god Saturn and worshipped as the original sun creator god, and we take that from mythology, then you have the problem that faced mainstream academia in the last century when they started really looking into mythology at great length. And that was that when they went out and looked at the sky, it didn't look like anything that mythology told them if they equated the gods with the various planets. So, god Saturn equals the planet Saturn, god Jupiter equals the planet Jupiter. Now, during these times, you had what were known as the five naked eye planets. And Saturn was the outermost of these planets, a pinprick of light right on the edge of the known solar system. And this simply did not equate to what most mythologists understood to be the almost pole star position of Saturn in mythology. All right. So, yes, they could look at Mars and they could see stories about that. They could see the scar on Mars's face, Venus with its fieriness and so on. But this position of Saturn at Earth's polar north made no sense to them whatsoever, simply because uniformitarianism as a concept ruled in mainstream academia, and that is that the Earth and the solar system have certainly, within the time span of humans being on the planet, been as we see them. The skies are as they are today and have been for billions of years. However, a comparative look at mythology around the world says that the ancients saw a very, very different and very frightening sky to the one we see today, in which Saturn ruled in splendor at the celestial north before losing its position in giant cataclysms and being banished to the outer realms. Now, as I said before, you had the five naked planets, and if you include Earth, you basically have 6 planets. And the number 6, of course, is related to the cube in that it is a 6-sided object. And Saturn being the 6th planet in the line of planets that they worked out, this is where the cube, was associated with the planet Saturn, why the number 6 was associated with the planet Saturn. But interestingly as well, why the number 6 is also is associated with mankind, particularly the male of the species. In terms of this kind of numerology and sort of ancient understandings. Now, a black cube also comes into play because when Saturn ruled as a sun, it was known as the Midnight Sun, that stood alone and still in the northern area where the pole star is. And you can read plenty of mythologists of the mainstream who scratch their head at this, this association with Saturn, with the area that we now associate with the pole star up in the north, and they don't get it, and therefore they attribute mythology as a form of fiction or dreaming, or just basically it's become a synonym with fairy tales
Right.
and the like. But it's shone at night because, for one reason, and that is that when Saturn was captured by the sun, there was an age-long period called the Golden Age when the sun was encroaching in the eastern part of the sky, setting in the west, and getting larger and larger while Saturn remained in this pole position above Earth. And as a result of its place, it shone brilliantly with the reflection of the sun, particularly the rings that form the famous bull horns that we see in many of the icons that are associated with Saturn. The horns of the bull that you'll see this particularly in Egyptian iconography, with the disc framed by the bull horns and so on. This is reflective, no pun intended, literally of Saturn's bathing in the light of the sun, which would have made Saturn very bright to those people who are on the dark side of Earth as it rotated away from the encroaching sun. And because it was the midnight sun, this is where black, and particularly black and blue, and also even the darker colors of purple, this is why Saturn is associated with these colors at that time. We see the symbology coming down in the mortarboards that we have during capping, the black cloaks that we wear, all this. This is what the priesthood sort of associated as being the color of Saturn, being the midnight sun. And of course, down through the modern age, when the Nazis got hold of all this idea, what they called the midnight sun, you have the swastika and so on being adapted to represent that. Well, it always basically did represent that in a much more benign way in ancient times, but they took a version of it that celebrated this dark midnight sun that shone at night. And this essentially is what's behind the association between Saturn and the cube type symbolism.
Well, that's a very interesting, and we'll go into some more of that after I ask this next question. But also, when we go into the final segment, Troy, would you mind pulling up some, quotations or excerpts from some of the mythology that you discovered in reading some of these ancient texts? And also, I'll ask you about the Colburn Bible, if you've read that, and we can talk about the destroyer there. But the other question before we get into that is they wanted to ask you about the fallen angels and or Lucifer ruling from Saturn, and how this links in with the Saturn death cult as well.
Okay. Of course, when we're talking about Lucifer, we're talking, the Judeo-Christian traditions, archangels and such. What has to always, this is very much my own take, where I, to me personally, is the important takeaway from what these fallen angels, what Lucifer is actually all about. Now, let me posit a question from a Christian theology point of view. If Lucifer is the devil and the fallen angels were to disappear tomorrow, would humans stop being sinners? In other words, would we stop somehow automatically being capable of committing atrocious acts and sins? My answer to that would be that no, simply because the idea that comes to enact atrocious acts, which range from everything from theft up to probably the most heinous thing, which is child ritual murder and such, it stems from an idea. Now, this is what is essentially, when you talk about angels, you're talking about messengers. And irrespective of what species they might be, whatever form they might take, for whatever role it is, a rational response to the role of angels and fallen angels and Lucifer is that it's their idea that is the virulent, uh, part of the equation, the aspect that is condemned throughout the Bible. Being messengers, they bring an idea. So if they exist as a species, in whatever form, other dimensional, I don't know, but it's the ideas that they implant in us, and this is where the problems begin. And that's my understanding of the angels. Now, from a Christian theological point of view, this is mirrored in the statement at the beginning of the Gospels. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh, and so on. Right now, the understanding there is that in the beginning was the Word, and it became flesh. It's not that in the beginning was the flesh or the species, and it had some words. It's the message to us that in the beginning was the idea first and foremost, and everything else, this reality that we have, is a manifestation of those ideas, and there are corrupted forms of those ideas, and Saturnian worship and its modern forms in what you would call Luciferism, Illuminatiism, these more modern sort of manifestations of these corrupted Saturnian ideas, Satanism, which is quite often portrayed. I would even go so far as to say as elements of Bolshevism and capitalism are involved in these kinds of ideas.
Right.
These have their origins as ideas, and irrespective of the species that brings them, I think that's where the threat is, and that's where our defense is. If you understand the idea and know it's false and know how to fight against it, or know its origins, know what it's about, you have a fantastic defense mechanism. But if you don't, an idea is probably the most destructive weapon ever, in the entire created cosmos, if you take a theological view.
Um, Wanted to ask you also, and as far as have you read the Coleman texts at all?
It's not familiar to me, the name, but describe them. I might have read them in some other context or something.
Okay, it's called the Colburn Bible, and it's a text that has just recently come to light in 2006. But, anyways, the aspect that I wanted to ask you about is it speaks about in an object called the Destroyer, and it's the same thing as what the the Hopi refer to as the blue and red star of the prophecy of the Kachina. And same thing that Sitchin speaks about as Nibiru or Planet X, and that there's this particular body or object or um, some say a whole, system, planetary system that comes around every 3,600 years or whatever the cycle is. But in your study, in as far as mythology, have you come across anything that mentions this particular object, and do you think it has anything to do with as far as any connections with the Saturn death cult, and also do you see it as having any kind of a part to play in the end of days, or because the Bible mentions wormwood, this particular mountain that is thrown into the oceans and that destroys a third of the ships and a third of the creatures in the sea, and some speculate that this could be a asteroid strike or a comet strike. But anyways, in the Colbran, it speaks about different times in our ancient past, even during the time of the Exodus, with Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, that some of the plagues, the red dust in Revelation, the oceans and the rivers turn into blood, that these kind of things have to do also with the dust that is this red dust that settles over the Earth whenever there's a flyby of this particular object. And so I wanted to ask you if there's any connections to this with this object, with the Saturn death cult, or if you have any commentary on whether you think this particular object or planet or has anything to do with the end of days or the prophecies of the end of days.
Right. Well, I mean, this is the crux of why we research this stuff, Zen, because my initial sort of reaction to that is, comes threefold. One is that there is much that represents Saturn itself that is attributed to this object. There is much that represents the planet Venus that is attributed to this object. And a lot of it, the threefold thing, is because we have this general confusion in interpreting mythology where attributes that should be given to Saturn, and particularly the planet Saturn, have been given to the sun as we know it, the thing that rises in the east and sets in the west. And this is one of the great confusions that Saturn theory has to fight against, because we're taught, and I'm somebody who went through a formal education in the classics, at university to a certain degree without distinguishing myself in any way or anything. Yet, we're taught about this, virtually all these cultures with some form of sun worship, as if it was the thing we see in the sky today, when in fact a closer look at it is that there has been a huge misidentification with what should be attributed to the planet Saturn in its form as the Earth's original sun, as a sub-round dwarf star. Now, as far as Sitchin and people talking about the advent of, being menaced by another object of similar like, to give you an example, you mentioned the Hopi, correct?
Right.
At the beginning and so on. I would suggest that that's a classic example of Saturn itself, all right, being identified there, that it's not something that can be attributed to a separate body. However, when you talk about the destruction of Saturn and the chaos and so on, there was a 1,000-year period where there was absolute chaos. You had Venus and Mars in particular basically jockeying around, causing all kinds of havoc to each other and to Earth, in accordance with with Saturn theory and its interpretation of mythology. You had the arrival of Jupiter at some point, and there is no reason, given the stories of the Titans and so on, to not suspect that some object may have been thrown out into a long-term orbit that is expected to return at some point. Now, as far as Sitchin and talk about Nduru and all that sort of stuff, I've always restricted my comments to saying that, is this not what I'm actually postulating with the arrival of Saturn itself? The fact that solar systems capture bodies and chaos, particularly the kind of chaos that results in the unleashing of vast electrical thunderbolts between in interplanetary collisions. This is all entirely possible. That there is a dark star out there. Cracky. The mainstream is fully aware that between us and the nearest mainstream star, there may be as many as 6,000 rogue sub-round dwarfs that we can't detect through optical means. And the only way we can detect these free-floating giants out there that would be as big and bigger than Jupiter is if we were to specifically go searching for them using radio telescopes and infrared telescopes. Well, nobody's doing that because we're obsessed with this gravity-only universe, and the Earth has been exactly as it is, and the solar system has been exactly as it is. But all these concepts are completely plausible. I just can't say that, without going to specific examples of parts of mythology and analyzing that as to which one is referring to which one. I mean, as I say, some of the stuff that is attributed to Nduru is perfectly explainable as being Venus when it was menacing the Earth.
Um, well, do you think then that Saturn, because I think you mentioned in your comment that you see Saturn returning some way to influence the Earth at the end of days? Is that correct, or can you elaborate at all
I
on
don't see it as physically returning. I think that if we were approached, because I subscribe to an electric universe model, if we were approached by an object the size of Saturn, the size of Neptune, even the size of the Earth, if it were to enter into our solar system, we start to see the kind of electrical activity that would be reflected throughout the solar system, and it would give us fair warning, that this may actually be coming. However, I think what you might be alluding to in the comments is that, and this goes to the breakaway civilization that's based on Saturn worship, the idea that there is a civilization for the last 100 years that has effectively been looting the world's economy to build a secret space program. And it's possible that Saturn, particularly when you look at this obsession with Saturn in NASA, Saturn V rockets and all this sort of stuff, and the NASA logo itself with its rings and stuff, that there's this obsession with Saturn and a desire to get out there and see what might be harbored out there, lurking around there, and so on. The same, can actually be applied to Jupiter. People who read Cosmos and Collision, my other book, will know that I, discuss the possibility that the moon Ganymede may have been the most logical place for a body in this solar system to have supported life like Earth out of all the objects that are in the solar system. And I give the various reasons, scientific reasons for that. So there's plenty out there to go and check out to see if there are, to see if you subscribe to this Saturnian type worship, to see if there's things to be found in the vicinity of Saturn itself and its rings, this sort of stuff. But yes, I would not put it past a breakaway civilization to be planning to rewild the Earth through a culling process of the population down to its Georgia Guidestone levels of 500 million people, while they sit it out by Saturn and then return in a couple of generations' time as kind of astronaut gods, if you know what I mean.
Yes, and I will elaborate on the other side, and because we're almost to the third break, and also when we return, I'm going to ask you about because for those that missed our first show that we did together about the cosmology and how things came to be as they are now. There's mention because we know that the Vatican, they set up this telescope there in Arizona called the Lucifer or something or another, and supposedly they are using it to watch for the return of this object as well, called the Destroyer. We'll be right back. Also, Troy, I sent you the Colburn, so check your email.
Okay, cheers.
All right, I'm going to read a really quick excerpt from the Colburn Bible on the Destroyer. This is from the Great Scroll. It says, O sentinels of the universe who watch for the destroyer, how long will your coming vigil last? O mortal men who wait without understanding, where will you hide yourselves in the dread days of doom, when the heavens shall be torn apart, and the skies rent in twain, in the days when children will turn gray-headed? This is the thing which you will be seen, this is the terror your eyes will behold. This is the form of destruction that will rush upon you. There will be the great body of fire, the glowing head with many mouths and eyes ever changing. Terrible teeth will be seen in formless mouths, and a fearful dark belly will glow redly from fires inside. Even the most stout-hearted man will tremble and his bowels be loosened. For this is not a thing understandable to men. It will be a vast, sky-spanning form enwrapping earth, burning with many hues within wide open mouths. These will descend to sweep across the face of the land, engulfing all in in its yawning jaws. The greatest warriors will charge against it in vain. The fangs will fall out, and lo, there are terror inspiring things of cold hardened water. Great boulders will be hurled down upon men, crushing them into red powder as the great salt waters rise up in its train, and roaring torrents pour towards the land. Even the heroes among mortal men will be overcome with madness. I just wanted to give you a, because you've never read it, Troy, never had chance to go through this particular text. It's quite extensive, and I did send you an electronic copy so that you would have it for your research if you should
Sure. Thank you
be
very much.
interested in looking at it. But anyways, comment on that and also the Lucifer telescope because there is, all this speculation out there that this particular object described as the destroyer is the very thing that that the Vatican is watching and waiting for, and also being hush hush about. And again, there's speculation that this might also possibly have connection with the wormwood of Revelation.
Mm. Well, to be honest, Zen, the quote that you gave me, let's face it, if mythology is anything to go by, humanity's, seen all this before.
Right.
So,
Exactly.
we've, if anything, the time since about 600 BC to now is the anomaly of, peacefulness when it comes to what our solar system has been like.
Right.
It's lulled us into this false sense of security that uniformitarianism, perpetuates, and this idea that everything changes only slowly,
Right.
over time and so on. So, and it harkens back to where we started at the beginning of this interview. This doomsday anxiety that is there within the human species, and for good reason. All right, we've gone through this stuff, terrifying. We survived as a species, but we live in a world now where there are certain occult agendas that seek to, how can I say, profit for themselves at the expense of others, when it should be obvious to anyone that we are as vulnerable to another bout of this kind of interplanetary cataclysmic behavior at any time. As I said earlier on, there are over 6,000 sub-brown dwarfs and brown dwarf stars estimated between us and the next nearest mainstream, uh, you know, the next nearest sunlight star that we have. So, it's you know, it, it's not without the realms of probability that we will face something like this again.
Right.
And my faith, belief, or whatever is that we will survive such a thing again. And rebuild. But whether or not these things can be tracked or are being tracked at this stage, I don't know for sure. My understanding of the electric universe model gives me a few things that tell me that stories about comets actually hitting this planet, in the near future, things like that, and wiping out the entire species, are a bit overblown. If anything, the electric nature of the universe gives you a certain protection, simply because the electrical nature tends to sort of veer things off, if you know what I mean. Yes, they come into contact through static electrical thunderbolts, and that can be horrendously damaging. But it's very rare for something to actually, for two bodies the size of Earth or larger to actually physically collide, on an intersecting path in an electric universe model. And of course, that tells you that these kinds of threats are survivable, which is one reason why it's nice to subscribe to the electric universe model.
Well, I wanted to ask you, as far as the cosmology of what you saw, shown and is told about in the mythology about some of the past cataclysm, and also, I don't know if you had a chance to maybe pull up or even paraphrase or tell us about some of the mythology that you've discovered and elaborate on that. And you can also, you know, also elaborate on the electric universe model that you're speaking of for those that are not familiar.
Sure. Okay. Well, okay. Central to the cosmology that's introduced in Saturn Death Column is often, you know, so at odds with the accepted mainstream idea of planetary formation, solar system formation, and so on, is this idea that Saturn was a sub-brown dwarf star, which is according to mainstream thinking, that is a star that doesn't quite become a star. It glows very lightly, but nonetheless is larger than Jupiter. In other words, a lot of people have postulated Jupiter as a failed brown dwarf star. And there's a lot of truth in that. But nonetheless, this idea that a sub-brown dwarf star can have its own satellites, and that Earth was originally a satellite of such a celestial body. For many people, this is beyond the pale. Where it gets really weird for people is this idea that from the Earth's perspective, this sub-brown dwarf could only be seen in the what we would call the pole star region, the celestial north of the Earth. Now, what that means essentially is that before Saturn lost its place in terms of its relationship with Earth, it means that the Earth literally dangled under the southern pole of Saturn, where they rotated in axial alignment with each other. This is what's called the polar configuration. And for those who are of a gravity, Newtonian mechanics only type universe, this is absurd beyond belief. They can't contemplate this as a model. They don't know how the physics would work, so they reject it and such. However, this is what mythology has actually told us was the conditions in terms of the inhabitants of Earth viewing what would later be identified as the planet Saturn. And I've developed in Cosmos and Collision a theory for layman's physics on how this would work based on the electric universe model that people can go and look at. But I would point out that for the detractors of this that say, look, this is impossible by Newtonian mechanics, we have seen precisely this configuration take place in our solar system within our lifetimes. Anybody who remembers the comet Shoemaker-Levy 9, the comet that broke up and slammed into Jupiter in the 1990s. I don't know if you remember that, Zen.
Yeah, I do. Was it like 9 fragments that?
It was 21 fragments.
Okay.
It's 21 fragments, and these fragments align themselves in exactly this polar configuration mode, and basically, flew through space in what became famously known as a string of pearls, where they maintained this formation like as if they were dangled on a string, and circling Jupiter until they came into contact with Jupiter and met their demise. Now, in all mainstream science, I have never ever seen a single attempt to explain how a configuration like this could take place, yet it was observed. All right. Now, a lot of people will say, okay, that's a smaller object. What you're talking about, a planetary-sized object, Saturn, with Earth and Mars dangling underneath it and so on. This is a slightly different scenario to deal with. However, in the electric universe model, one of its great strengths is that it's scalable, By that I mean that at a laboratory level, you can demonstrate things that will, physics that will be completely and utterly valid for objects, to the size of planets and such, right? So if we look at the observation of this comet Shoemaker-Levy in its string of pearls thing, we see an observed example of this polar configuration, within our lifetimes. We also have plenty of axial aligned linear objects throughout the galaxy that we have been spotting that nobody associates with planets, yet they behave in exactly the same manner of which we're talking, the Earth behaving under Saturn. What I'm talking about are Harvick Harrow objects. Now, these are protostars that mainstream science will tell you are spewing out gas from their poles like great big jets of gas. And within these jets of gas are these little baubles of plasma that nobody knows what's in there for sure or anything along those lines. But they maintain this this position. These are young objects that are forming as they are. Now, mainstream science will tell you that this is gas jets, similar to what you would see if a jet engine or a rocket were letting off gas and creating a tail behind it. The only problem with this is that gas in a vacuum, of which space is a near vacuum, doesn't jet, it dissipates. All right. And the only known force that can hold plasma or ionized gas in the configuration we see in a Herbig Harrow object has to be electricity. And once again, this applies back to the electric universe model that says there is a giant galactic electrical circuit that holds most things, holds the entire universe together. That it's not entirely just gravity driven, that there is no such thing as dark matter, black holes. If on an aside, I have to probably, there's a lot of people who scratching their head, hey, he's gone right off the deep end here by denying what is considered fact. My understanding of black holes and dark matter is that when they do the calculations for a gravity-driven universe only, they find that there is not enough observable mass out there. So they created black holes at the center of the galaxy to explain why everything, held together. They said that's where the gravity was coming from. Then they found that didn't work out, that still didn't do the job, so they created dark matter. And even when that started to fail, and they said dark matter represented 95%, but we couldn't see it, we couldn't send something out to get it or anything, they said it's down to dark energy and so on. And they relate it all to gravity. This is the equivalent of saying, here's an orchard with some orange trees. According to my calculations, 10 orange trees will produce 100 oranges. All right. When the harvest comes, what you actually see are 5 oranges. And so the person who's done the mathematical equations goes, well, the other 95 oranges are invisible. They're dark oranges. All right. Right. And you say, no, I don't see them. We can't get them or anything. And of course they scream, but the mathematics says so. No, black holes, dark matter, the gravity thing is actually created as a way of making the mathematics work. Do you get what I'm saying?
Right.
They've introduced a variable to make it work. It doesn't work, it's stuff that you've never observed or anything like that. If you take it all out, it doesn't work for them. The electric universe is a far better idea. Magnetism through magnetism through electrical forces transmitted through plasma and such, in a giant galactic circuit explains a lot of these, anomalies, including these linear axial aligned objects called Herbig Harrow. It's my suggestion in Cosmos and Collision that what we're proposing about Saturn and Earth's original relationship is that it started as part of a protostar sequence that broke up and eventually came together to form the solar system as we know it, but did so in its original linear, sort of form. Now, you've asked me for the mythological evidence, an example. for these sorts of things. Okay, if I read from the Popol Vuh, all right, which is a Mesoamerican text, written a full 6,000 years approximately, um, you know, after the traditional Christian myths, creation myths. Basically, to quote, like a man was the sun when it showed itself. It showed itself when it was born and remained fixed in the sky like a mirror. Certainly, it was not the same sun that we see, it is said of their old tales. Now, that's referring to a sun that stays still in the sky. This is a common theme throughout mythology. All right, so among the Chinese, the supreme force in the cosmos was Shangdi, the same as Shangdi, the Lord of the Heavens. Shangdi was represented symbolically by the sky's north pole, the spot around which the entire sky seems to circle in an orderly parade. This is the scholar E.C. Krutt looking at Chinese mythology and his observation for that. The If we go to the Macaritari tribe of Venezuela, called the current sun Shi, but their primordial god, in other words, the god before the current sun, was like a sun that never sets. All right, now that's out of the that's an Orinoco creation cycle tale taken out of Venezuela. Sorry.
Interesting. Please continue.
Well, okay. If we get to sort of the influences on Western mythology, you can't get past what the Egyptians were saying. All right, and the Egyptian book of the Dead describes the sun god Ra, the thing that modern mainstream academia says belongs entirely to the sun that we see in the sky today. It describes it as, O thou firstborn, who dost lie without movement, okay, which is the opposite of what our sun actually does, all right? Mm-hmm. And from other ancient, Ra is described as lying without movement, or who rests in his high place in the north, okay? And then in talking about Osiris, who's regarded as an example of Ra being the Egyptian equivalent of Saturn, I should say. All right. O thou who art without motion, like unto Osiris. Right. Now this is referring to people who have died as being like Osiris without motion. In other words, the so-called sun god of ancient Egypt was always known to have stayed at the top of a pillar up in the north. The Great Pyramid that people marvel over and so on is the most perfectly aligned building on this planet, even more perfect than the Greenwich Observatory in London. It's the most perfectly aligned building to celestial north that we have on the planet here. All those entry points and channels that they see, they do not face east and west. They face north and south. All right. And so if you look closely at the configuration, the pyramid is oriented to the north primarily. Why? Because the Egyptians looked to the north to where Ra held his place. This is that pole star confusion that so many scholars had. Why are they putting the equivalent of Saturn always up in the north? So, we have, oh, crikey, if I, pull out a few other ones. Let's see if I can get another script here from some other source. Well, what I can also point to is Nordic literature. Valhalla, the Nordic gods always were placed as having been in the north. Greek literature, which gives us Saturn or Kronos itself, was always positioned up in the north as far as where the home of the gods used to be.
Any idea, Troy, as to the timeline when it was located in the north as far as the sun? And you say it's Saturn, so any idea when it was aligned like this and the cosmology reflected this particular alignment?
I would say that the alignment, we start where it came to an end, which is around anywhere between 4000 and 6000 BC, when the alignment started to be threatened. Before that, there was this period known as the Golden Age. Now, that could have lasted up to 10,000 years itself, certainly at least as long as 1,000 years. So if we take that scale, then what we're looking at is the Golden Age took place sometime before 4000 BC, going as far back as, let me get my math right here, going as far back as maybe 14,000, 15,000 BC. You know, as far as this creation of the Golden Age, which jives very well with some of the more ancient monuments that people are digging up and finding. It ends at about 4000 BC, but it starts, let's say, anywhere up to 10,000, 12,000 BC. Prior to that is what you in mythology refer to as the purple dawn of creation. This is before light entered the world. This is before the let there be light moment of the creation epic story in the Bible, for instance, when it was all darkness and this, the spirit of God just hovered in the celestial ocean, without moving. So that is an indeterminate period of time, Zed, which is a study in its own.
Well, hey, Troy, I appreciate you, brother. We'll definitely have you on again so we can elaborate further.